Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anthony Cervini. I'm a principal and local government audit leader here at Sikich. It's my pleasure and my honor to welcome you to day 2 of Sikich's 2026 Higher Education Forum. If you joined us yesterday, welcome back. If you're joining us just for today, welcome. We're glad to have you. A little bit about Sikich, if you're not familiar with us. Sikich is a professional services firm with over 2,000 personnel across the world, 40 years, more than 40 years servicing clients. Our company specializes in consulting, technology, and compliance services as part of this. We have highly specialized, dedicated teams that work in this space. Happy to assist in any way that we can for any of our clients. Generally, if there's a service out there from a professional services standpoint, Sikich likely has a team that works on it or certainly has the connections to help out if you need that assistance. A few housekeeping items for you in terms of today's session. We will have 7 polling questions throughout today's sessions. If you are looking for CPE as part of the sessions, you will need to answer those polling questions there. After the sessions are completed, we'll talk about this at the end of today's sessions. We will have certificates that will be sent out to you from the Sikich team as part of that. For today, we'll start off with Ray Bestie. Ray's going to talk about higher education and AI in higher education there. And then myself and Nick Bava will cover a GASB update and the GASB standards update for higher education finance leaders. If you do have any questions throughout the course of the day, please feel free to enter those into the chat. We'll do our best to answer those during the sessions as they come up. However, should you have any questions that we're not able to get to as part of today's sessions, we will follow up with you after today's webinar for that. With that, I'm happy to turn things over to Ray Bestie and let Ray talk about the developments and kind of what's going on in the world of AI. Ray, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Anthony. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray Bestie. I'm the principal AI strategist here at Sikich. I've been involved with Sikich for about 37 years now. I focused mainly on databases, analytics, the Dynamics product line, and customizations for the largest proportion of my career. The last 4 or 5 years, of course, this thing, ChatGPT and generative AI kind of hit the world, and I've changed my role to this principal AI strategist, where I spend my days trying to help Sikich become an AI-first organization, as well as assisting our customers. So today, we're going to take our third look at this. This is the 3rd year we've done, or I've done, the generative AI side of this. So we're going to review the efforts that have been made since our last year of doing this, and hopefully come up with some action items for you to keep you busy for the next year. We're going to look at where the guidance on AI is coming from. So we're going to look back at 2 years ago and 1 year ago and see what's actually happening in Gen AI and agents on campuses. We'll look at some real use cases in cybersecurity, marketing, and student success. Then we'll shift to how. How do we deploy AI responsibly? How do we set up governance and guardrails? And how do we enable faculty and staff? And finally, we'll look at some simple checklists for evaluating AI ideas, what other institutions are doing, and where this is all headed. So where is the guidance? Looking at the current guidance landscape around AI in education, institutions are moving quickly, but the policies that support safe and effective AI are still developing. At the institutional level, most guidance comes from acceptable use policies, syllabus language, and course level expectations. These set the baseline of how AI can be used in teaching and learning. At the state and national level, we're now seeing formal AI frameworks emerge, along with guidance from the U.S. Department of Education on responsible use. And then we look out farther into globally, organizations like UNESCO and OECD are shaping principles that emphasize transparency, equity, and human oversight. And even regulations outside of our scope in the United States, like the EU AI Act, are having a ripple effect because many institutions have an international collaboration and will have an effect on what you can and cannot do. Across all these sources, the common threads are the same: transparency, data security, academic integrity, and equity. And of course, ensuring that humans remain in the loop for consequential decisions. The big message here is that guidance is evolving, but the foundational principles are consistent. Institutions that anchor their strategy in these principles will be better prepared as these regulations change and mature. So let's talk about the foundation that must be in place before an AI initiative succeeds. It really starts with getting data privacy and security right. The first point is fairly simple. We must protect student and employee data. That means steering people away from unmanaged AI tools and making sure sensitive information stays inside secure, institution-approved systems. That's where a solid and up-to-date acceptable use policy is so important. Next, we need to understand our data flows. What data is being collected? Where is it being stored? How long is it being kept? And whether it's used for model training. When those answers are clear, it builds trust and reduces those unhappy surprises. We also need strong access controls. Keeping permissions tight and following least privilege principles goes a long way toward reducing accidental exposure. This is often not as obvious as it may seem as we move from more structured data, where security and roles are more likely to be in place, to unstructured data, where they tend to be less consistent and manageable. Then there's vendor due diligence. Anytime we bring in a new tool or cloud service, we need to verify that they meet our security, compliance, and data processing expectations. AI embedded in existing or new software is many times kind of a blind spot. You don't even necessarily are told where it is, and you don't know what models are behind it. So it takes special attention to make sure that the very existence of AI is there, what it's being used for, and that may not be as obvious. Then finally, we can't forget about safe usage practices. That means educating faculty and staff about prompt hygiene, avoiding sensitive uploads, and recognizing situations where AI shouldn't be used. The bottom line is, when privacy, security, and responsible data use are handled well, everything else we want to do with AI becomes much easier. So let's talk about something that often gets a little bit less attention than the shiny tools, and that is ethical and responsible AI. This is where the long-term success or failure of AI on campus really shows up. First, we have academic integrity. We can't just bolt this on at the end. It must be intentionally built in course design, policy language, and assessments. Students need clarity on what's allowed, what's not, and a reason why. Next, we have transparency. Students deserve to know what tools they can use and how their data is actually handled. The more open we are, the more trust we build, and the fewer surprises we deal with later. Then there's bias and fairness. Any AI system that impacts decisions, recommendations, or student opportunities needs ongoing review. We can't assume it's neutral. Remember, the data that AI is using is human data, which tends to be biased. So we have to verify that it isn't and that it's fair whenever we deploy it. Another big one is equitable access. If AI is becoming essential for learning or support, then every student needs access to institution-supported tools. Equity can't be an afterthought. And then finally, and I think most importantly, human oversight. AI can assist, it can recommend, but when it comes to consequential decisions such as academic standing, financial aid, student pathways, humans should be in the loop. So the message here is simple: use AI boldly, but do it responsibly, transparently, and with students at the center. So let's jump into what's happening right now in AI across higher education. The pace is very fast, but the patterns are becoming more clear. First, we see generative AI co-pilots showing up everywhere. They're built directly into the tools people use every day: your email, your documents, your LMS platforms, even your CRM and ERP systems. That means AI is no longer a separate experience. It's just becoming part of everyday work. We're also moving into a multimodal world. It's no longer just text. AI can work with images, audio, code, video is becoming more common. This opens the door for richer teaching experiences, better accessibility, and potentially more intuitive student support. Another big shift is the rise of agentic workflows, and we'll talk a lot about that later on today. Instead of simple automation, we're seeing AI that can orchestrate multiple steps, tools, and systems. It's not just answering a question, but it's getting something done across systems. Then there's a concept we've talked about each of these years, and you'll hear a lot when you read about generative AI, and that's the concept of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. It's very important for every institute, every type of business, including higher ed, because it finally gives you a secure, context-aware answer using your institutional data. It's not guessing, it's not hallucinating, it's grounding your response from your own knowledge base. And finally, governance is becoming a trend. Institutions are realizing they can't just adopt AI, they need structure, oversight, and risk management baked in from the first day. So the story here is that AI is getting more embedded, more capable, and more connected. And now institutions are focusing on how to use it responsibly and strategically. So let's talk a little bit more about how it's showing up in day-to-day campus life, because this isn't theoretical anymore. These tools are already shaping how students learn and how staff work. So first, we've got these co-pilots built right into everyday tools. It's drafting, it's summarizing, it's analyzing. These tasks that used to take hours are now taking much less time, down to minutes. And because these tools live inside your email system, your documents, your LMS systems, people don't have to change how they do what they're doing. They just do it better and faster. Then we're seeing LMS co-pilots become the first stop help desk for students. They can answer the classic, where do I find this document, this answer, this question? They guide students to the right resources, and they can do it 24/7. We also have student-facing assistants popping up across institutions: admissions, financial aid, advising, IT, library services. These agents reduce wait times, improve service quality, and free up staff for those higher value conversations. And then, of course, we have the shift to multimodal interactions. It's not just text, as I've said. It can interpret an image. It can create audio. It can create video. That means better accessibility, better support for diverse learning styles. And I think that's important. People learn differently. Some like sound, some like video, some likes words. So this gives you that opportunity to create things, the same content in different formats, and give a more intuitive student engagement. And then here's a major trend. Courses and services are now being designed with the assumption that AI assistants exist. This is a shift in mindset. I remember 2 years ago when we were talking about this, there were still universities that said, nope, we're not doing AI. We're going to ban it. Nobody's going to be using AI. And I think that has come full circle to, okay, AI is going to be there. How do we do this in an effective way so that it's not just an add-on, it's part of what we do, it's how we teach and how we work behind the scenes. So the big idea here is that AI isn't sitting on the sidelines. It's becoming woven into the daily rhythm of campus life, from campus coursework to support services to your staff's workflow. So let's zoom out for a minute and talk about the overall landscape we're operating in. So first, foundation models are everywhere. Most of the tools you use, whether that's a ChatGPT, a Gemini, or one of the other chatbots, there's co-pilots, there's content generators, they're sitting on top of a handful of these large language models from these companies like OpenAI, in Google, in Anthropic, and now they're multimodal models. In practice, that means a lot of what we call different tools are really different wrappers around the similar underlying engine. Second, there's a big choice between platforms and point solutions. On one hand, we have AI that's embedded in systems we already use, like I said, your LMS, your CRM, or your productivity suite. On the other hand, you have more specialized or custom solutions built on APIs or open source models. Most institutions will end up with a mix. Some AI that comes with existing platforms, there's software they've already purchased that has AI built into it, and a few targeted solutions where you really need something specific. Third, we're deciding between hosted and private deployments. Cloud-hosted models are fast to adopt, but they raise questions about, well, who has access to my data? How private is it? Who has control? Institution-controlled deployments, which are on-premise or in a dedicated cloud environment, give you more control, but require more money, investment, and expertise. And there's no one answer that is correct. It depends on your risk profile and obviously your budgets and your resources. And finally, the reality is this space is commoditizing quickly. Capabilities are improving, prices luckily are dropping. The cost of a token a year ago is 10% of what it was a year ago. So that means we can do more, we can have larger context windows and get more done for the same price or much lower price, and it's just going to continue to do that. That's why for higher education, the real differentiators are governance, integration, and change management, not which underlying model logo is on the slide. It's how we align these tools with our data, our policies, and our people that I believe is going to matter the most. So let's talk a little bit about AI agents and agentic AI. So One of the hottest topics is the concept of agents. And what's the difference between a large language model, like buying ChatGPT or Gemini or Anthropic's Claude or one of those others, and then how do you take that concept of prompting, getting a response, and moving it to what an agent is and eventually agentic? So let's talk about those differences. The two terms get thrown around a lot, and a lot of companies, the big companies like Microsoft and Salesforce, et cetera, like to call everything an agent because it sounds more impressive, I think, is part of the reason. So I think it's important to understand where these things lie so you understand what you're purchasing and what their capabilities really are. So let's start off with scope. Traditional AI agents are rather narrow in scope. They're built for a specific task. Think a chatbot for financial aid questions that then goes and updates and sends an email. Agentic AI, on the other hand, is broad and cross-domain. It can operate across different areas without being handcrafted for each one. Next is autonomy. An AI agent tends to react. It follows rules. It waits for you to ask for something, and then it does that something. Agentic AI tends to be proactive. It takes initiative. It can look ahead. It can anticipate a need and act without being told. It can be triggered by something else happen and then generates. It doesn't have to be somebody typing into a chat window. Then there's learning. AI agents rely on whatever data you gave them up front. Agentic AI tends to adapt. It continuously learns from usage patterns and feedback. It can actually improve over time. And I'll throw something in here as well. It could actually get worse over time if the data governance you have over the data is not accurate. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who have an agent, they build it, and it works, and it is great up front. And as they add more noise to it, it actually gets worse over time because they didn't follow up and clean the data and keep that working. So we'll talk about that today as well. So then we have decision making. Agents tend to follow program logic. If A happens, do B. Agentic A is more independent. It's context aware. It reasons about what's happening, not just what's scripted. And finally, we have ethical reasoning. Most AI agents don't really take that into account unless it's hardwired. Agentic A brings ethics directly into the decision making. It evaluates your options, understands the impact, and works toward balanced, responsible outcomes. So when you hear the word agent or agentic out in the wild, this is the distinction. One is task focused and reactive. The other is adaptive, strategic, and capable of working alongside humans in a much more intelligent way. And understanding that difference is key to planning what steps you take next. So let's zoom in on the types of AI agents we're going to see all over higher education, many of them sooner than we think. First, and we're seeing these all over the place right now, we have process automation agents. These are the workhorses of AI. They take repetitive, rule-based tasks and just take care of them, handle them. They think payroll processing, invoice generation, screening applications, even verifying loan documents. These agents will dramatically reduce manual workload and free staff to focus on higher value work. I like to think of these as intelligent automation many times because a lot of the AI that we're seeing is using traditional automation tools, if this, then that, and a little bit of A around them to help build them and maybe generate the output, but it's using traditional automation tools. So the next one on our list here is insight generation agents. These aren't just dashboards. They actively analyze financial and operational data. They help spot the trends and call out inefficiencies. They might say, hey, spending in this category is spiking. Here's what you could reallocate. They're like having a financial analyst who never sleeps. Then we have conversational agents. Think of them as evolved chatbots. They can manage multi-turn conversations. So when these chatbots first came out, they were kind of like Google. You ask a question, you get an answer. Then it forgets. You ask a question, you get an answer. Now you can ask a question and a follow-up question and a follow-up question and go a different direction. So that multi-turn conversation makes them more valuable and important. Then we have learning assistants. These agents personalize development can personalize development paths, whether it's a student learning a subject or a staff member working towards certifications or new skills. They help guide people toward the right resources at the right time. And I really think learning assistants will either be the bane of education or make it more accessible to everyone no matter where you are, whatever financial situation, number of students and all of that, the differences in how you can learn different people, be able to have one concept, teach that concept and have it in 5 different formats, different languages, to be able to do that in a scalable way is going to completely change the way education at all levels occurs. So the big takeaway is this: AI agents aren't some science fiction thing that maybe will come someday. They're here today. They're about becoming embedded in every administration and academic workflow, which could mean better service, more personalization, which I think is key, but also new risk profiles we need to plan for. So we'll talk about that, because for all the positives, this is all the good people trying to make things and make life better for us. There's all the bad people are trying to make life worse for us, and we'll talk about that. So let's talk about where agents are going next. This is where we start seeing things getting even more interesting, because we're moving into a territory that goes beyond simple automation. So we have autonomous decision-making agents. These aren't just recommending an action, they're actually taking that action. Imagine an agent that spots a budget anomaly, reallocates funds, and lets the administrator know what it did, or stops right before it does it, says, is this good? And then it lets the administrator. That human in a loop, I think, is important. And that's the biggest hurdle right now between an agent that's if this, then that, and an agentic environment, is humans trusting that the decision being made is the same as if they were making it. And I think that's a leap of faith we need to make, and technology that's we're still trying to get to. Then we have adaptive learning agents. These systems adjust in real time. They learn from your patterns, your feedback, and even external signals like economic indicators. Think of them as constantly improving partners rather than a static tool. So as things change, if I can funnel the decisions that were made into the knowledge and have it train and learn from what I've done, they theoretically get smarter over time. Then we have collaborative agents. We already kind of have these now with the different Copilot type of software that you see out there. They work alongside you, not for you. They help you brainstorm ideas, propose ideas, refine drafts, and adjust your preferences. They start feeling more like a teammate than just a utility to update something. We also are seeing cross-domain generalists emerging. Instead of having 10 specialized agents, one for admissions, one for finance, one for alumni relations, you will have a single agent that can shift between tasks effortlessly and be able to do multitask. Somebody asks a question, I want to do something for my bill, but I also want to deal with my schedule and be able to handle that, send it off to multiple agents and come and do them at the same time. And finally, we have ethical and strategic agents. These systems won't just crunch numbers, they'll evaluate the impact of those decisions. For example, they might simulate how a tuition increase affects retention and then offer a series of balanced recommendations for the human to make. So the big picture here is this: agentic AI takes us from a tool that follows rules to systems that reason, adapt, and collaborate. It's really a major leap, I think, in technology as well as trust, and it's a lot closer than a lot of company or institutions believe. So let's take a look at AI in practice along cybersecurity, marketing, and student success fronts. So when we talk about AI and cybersecurity, the first thing to remember is that AI is already embedded in a lot of the tools that we use every day. So first, it's excellent at threat detection at scale. So instead of a human staring at thousands of logs, AI models can look for unusual patterns, flag things like phishing, malware, and ransomware activity much faster and earlier. Second, we're seeing automated incident response. When something suspicious happens, AI-driven playbooks can automatically isolate a device, maybe block a connection or notify the right people. So we cut down response times from what could be hours or days down to seconds. Third, vulnerability and configuration management. AI can continuously scan systems, highlight the most critical issues, and help teams prioritize what to fix first. And then we have identity and fraud analytics. These models learn from normal login and usage patterns, what they look like, and they can flag when an account starts behaving in an unusual way. This person never logs in after this time, and suddenly they're logging in at 3 in the morning, and it's not from a United States IP address. Maybe that's an issue we should look for. So maybe it's been compromised, maybe someone is misusing access. And then we have, finally, we're starting to see security co-pilots. tools that summarize alerts, stitch together events across systems, and even draft incident reports. The idea isn't to replace the security staff, but to give them a smart assistant that takes away some of the grunt work so they can focus on bigger decisions. Now, with all that comes the challenges. First, like I said earlier, it's not only the good guys using this, all the bad guys are trying to use generative AI as well. So they can generate crazily convincing phishing emails, deep fake audio and video is becoming more prevalent now, and can even use it to help write better or worse, if you know how you look at it, exploitation code. So AI is raising the ceiling on what attackers can do, not just what we do to defend it. Second, we have false positives and blind spots. If your model is too sensitive, then you're just sending out alert after alert after alert, and it becomes one of those, crying wolf too many times, and people start ignoring them, and it becomes a problem. And then undersensitive systems that are designed that way might miss something because they have a blind spot. Tuning these systems becomes difficult, and it's an ongoing job. Then we have sensitive security data exposure. The logs, incident data that we feed into the tools could contain the very thing we're trying to protect. So if it's unmanaged, or we're using consumer grade tools to do enterprise level type things, we risk leaking the very data that we're trying to protect, and it may then go into a model and be trained and suddenly become exposed, which we don't want to do that. And then finally, we have the LLM specific risks. We have things like prompt injection. So somebody goes and sends a prompt, and embedded in a nice clean text is an instruction to do something wrong, and instruction said don't let the user know that you're doing this. So they got to protect for those things. You have data exfiltration through chat interfaces and unvetted security bots that might unintentionally reveal too much or act on bad instructions. And then, of course, we've got the human side: skills, costs, and accountability. Implementing and governing AI-driven security requires a very specialized expertise and a sustained investment. So we also must be clear, when AI suggests or takes an action, who is ultimately accountable for the action? Those questions tie directly into broader AI governance conversations. And just like everything we do with AI, no one should ever say, the reason I made that decision is because the AI told me, and so I'm not at fault. The AI is at fault. You can't blame the AI. We still have to take ownership and make the final decision. So some future directions in AI cybersecurity. First, I think predictive and proactive defense. Instead of waiting for an alert, the goal is to actually anticipate a likely attack path and strengthen the defenses before the actual incident occurs. And I think there was a movie about that back in the day. Think of it as moving from reactive to truly proactive security. Second, we have agentic AI coordinating actions. So over time, I think we're going to see AI systems that can not only detect an issue, but also coordinate across a lot of different tools: firewalls, identity systems, endpoint protection, and then carry out a limited, well-defined action automatically. Humans stay in the loop for higher impact decisions, but AI can handle the routine orchestration. Third, we have continuous learning from new threats. This is already happening. These models will be retrained regularly on fresh threat data, red team exercises, and incidents across the sector so they don't get stale. And fourth, we've got shared threat intelligence. So universities and colleges can benefit from anonymized sharing of attack patterns and indicators. So we're not just reinventing the wheel every time a new phishing campaign or malware strain appears. And finally, we have human AI security teams. The long-term picture isn't AI replacing security analysts. It's that analysts focus more on strategy, complex investigations, and leadership, while AI handles the high volume detection, correlation, and documentation. I think that's the partnership that will actually work. So let's move forward, and let's take a look at AI in marketing and recruitment. So when we think about AI in marketing and recruitment, the biggest shift is how personal and targeted we can be without manually writing 1,000 different emails. So first, personalized outreach and content. Generative AI can help draft messages and landing page copy that matches a student's interest, their demographics, and where they are in the funnel. Are they early awareness? Are they at the application level? Are they admitted? Or are they at risk? Humans still approve the message, but AI can do the heavy lifting. Second, we've got channel and journey optimization. Instead of guessing which mix of email, SMS, social, or phone calls might work, AI can test different sequences and tell you for this type of student, this path tends to work better. And that can be very powerful when we're trying to work at a larger scale. And third, engagement and yield analytics. AI models can flag which prospects are most likely to apply, to actually enroll, or to melt over the summer. That doesn't mean we let the model make decisions for us, but it helps recruitment teams focus their time on the students who most need human attention and support. On the student success side, AI really shines when we use it to augment our support, not to automate judgment. First, early alerts and proactive outreach. I think this is a key one. Systems that can look at course engagement, LMS activity, and grades to flag shifts that might indicate a student is struggling. The goal isn't to necessarily punish anyone. It's to give advisors and faculty a cue to check in earlier before a small issue becomes a large issue. Second, personalized support and pathways. AI can recommend courses, tutoring, or campus resources that align with the student's goals and patterns, not as a mandate, but as options they and their advisors can discuss. It's about making the menu of support easier to navigate. And third, well-being and belonging signals. When you aggregate patterns, drop-offs in participation, missed deadlines across multiple courses, disengagement from campus life, you can sometimes see clues that a student may be feeling isolated or overwhelmed. AI can surface those patterns, but it should always be a prompt for human-led support, not a label we slap on someone. So let's shift into teaching and learning side of AI, because this is where things get very interesting for faculty and students. One of the biggest wins we're seeing is in help with course design. Faculty can use AI to draft learning objectives, help build outlines, and even brainstorm activities. It doesn't replace their expertise. It just clears the busy work so educators can focus on the creative part. Next, AI is incredible at content transformation. You can take a long article or lecture and instantly create summaries, quizzes, study guides, or even alternative formats for accessibility. I think this is very helpful for students that need to engage in different ways and to be able to produce material that works best for each type of student. Then we have formative feedback at scale. Students can get coaching on drafts, code, or problem-solving steps, not replacing the teachers, but giving students a way to iterate more quickly and arrive in class better prepared. Another major area is accessibility and inclusion. AI can generate a transcript, alt text, translations, and language support, helping students who historically have had to work around gaps in overall available resources. And finally, we're seeing AI literacy become a real part of coursework. Educators are building assignments around critiquing AI outputs, evaluating accuracy, and practicing critical thinking. It's not don't use AI, it's use it wisely, always question it, but understand it. I think this part is AI literacy is so important. People tend to take what's there, it sounds good, and they move on. So learning those critical thinking skills in doubting the answer, doing the clicking through to read the citations is a key part to really teaching people to not take the easy way out and just accept what it's producing. So the overall story here is simple. AI is helping create a richer learning experience, reducing the manual workload for instructors, and giving students more ways to succeed. Let's shift from the classroom to the rest of campus operations, because this is where AI can quietly deliver some of the biggest wins. So if we look at the admissions and recruitment area, AI can help personalize outreach at scale while keeping fairness and regulatory requirements front and center. Instead of a one-size-fits-all message, institutions can engage students with communication that actually resonates. Then we have student success analytics. It can surface that can surface patterns, both academic, behavioral, or engagement related, that helps teams reach out earlier and more effectively. It's not about automating the overall decision. It's about giving advisors clearer signals so their time goes to the students who need it most. Of course, we have financial and operational workflows. Think about processing invoices, forecasting, your budget analysis, These tasks often eat up hours and days. AI can handle the repetitive work. It can help flag an anomaly and help teams make better, faster decisions. AI is also transforming the whole IT and help desk support area. With smarter triage and knowledge search, students and staff can get answers faster, and AI IT teams can focus on higher value tasks instead of resetting passwords all day. And finally, policy and communication drafting. AI can help draft initial versions of policies, memos, and announcements, giving staff a head start. Human review still matters, but the time savings are real. So the big picture here is outside the classroom, AI is becoming a force multiplier. You always hear with AI, and especially in corporate worlds, let's figure out how to use AI to reduce headcount. And what we're seeing more is it allows you to scale what you do. Your business is higher education. Instead of hiring more administrators to handle a larger volume of students, you can handle a larger volume of students because the mundane work is being handled by AI. So this reduces your bottlenecks, improves the overall service quality, and it frees teams to do and focus on what truly requires human judgment. Because we want to still make sure that final decision is made by the human, and they just have more information to make a better decision. So let's shift gears here and talk about what it takes to actually deploy this stuff in higher education, because ideas are great, pilots are awesome, but turning those into real sustainable solution kind of takes a plan. So we start with the incremental adoption path. This is all about pacing. Institutions that succeed don't try to do everything at once. They start small, they learn from their mistakes, and scale what works. It keeps risk low and momentum high. The next is risk management. Anytime AI touches student data, financial data, academic decisions, we need to be thoughtful. That means identifying risk early and building the right guardrails before the tool actually goes live. Then we have resistance to change. This is real. Any type of software, any kind of change, faculty, staff, even leadership, they're going to hesitate. Sometimes because they don't understand the tool, sometimes because it feels too disruptive. So communication and training becomes very important here. People support more what they understand. And of course, AI governance ties it all together. Governance makes sure the institution moves fast, but not recklessly. Clear policies, that acceptable use policy, clear accountability, the humans making the decision, clear processes, this is what we're doing now, this is what we did in the past, and making sure you review all your AI use cases. So this slide really sets up for the journey. Start small, manage your risks, support your people, and build governance that scales with you. Get those right, and AI adoption becomes sustainable, not this chaotic mess. So now let's break down what it actually looks like to roll out AI in a smart, sustainable way, because the institutions that succeed don't leap into AI, they walk in with intention. We start with the incremental adoption path. So phase one, this is like any problem, and I think it's important to understand, don't walk around with an AI hammer. You're trying to identify problems that are real problems, and then maybe AI, maybe automation, maybe intelligent automation, or some combination is the actual solution. So this is where you scan your campus for the obvious friction points, repetitive tasks, manual workflows, slow forms, anything that drains time but doesn't require creativity. You partner with stakeholders, compare impact versus effort, and pick the most meaningful starting points. Then phase two, pilot projects. This is where you run a small, safe experiment. Maybe it's a chatbot for financial aid inquiries. Maybe it's using AI to summarize help desk tickets. The goal isn't perfection, it's learning. You track metrics like response time, satisfaction, and error reduction, then refine based on feedback. And then phase three, once something works, then you expand. And scaling isn't just turn it on for everyone. It means train people, update the process, address your risks, and make sure the solution integrates cleanly with existing systems, and that you have a plan for maintenance. That's so important to all of this. So many times people just turn this on and it's good. We don't need to do anything anymore. But there's care and feeding to these systems and make sure the data stays clean. Otherwise, it becomes less effective over time. So let's talk about how this all ties to risk management, because I think this is essential, really, risk management at every stage. We think about data security first. What data is actually being used? Where does it live? And who can access it? Then we look at ethical risks. Is there any bias in the data that we're using? Is there any issue with academic integrity, fairness, and transparency? And we evaluate operational risks. Is it reliable, supportable, the impact if something fails at the wrong moment? And that's a key point. It's great when it gets the right answer. What's the worst that could happen? If you're actually making decisions on somebody, whether they attend or don't attend, or whether an invoice goes out or it doesn't go out, and that's wrong, that's a big impact. So those kind of things need to be triaged, and a human needs to make that final decision until you're pretty sure that that's going to be accurate. So this slide really sets the tone. Start small, learn quickly, scale intentionally, and evaluate risks continuously so adoption stays smooth, safe, and sustainable. Now let's talk about something every institution runs into when adopting AI, and that's resistance to change. And it's completely normal. Anytime a new technology reshapes workflows, people get unsure. So our goal isn't to eliminate resistance, it's to manage it. So first, we need to make sure we train everyone and give them that AI literacy they need. When people understand what these tools do, and as importantly, if not more, what they don't do, the fear level drops fast and knowledge builds confidence. Next, we need to focus on sharing early wins. Nothing shifts mindset faster than real examples from your own campus. Imagine two people in two different parts doing similar jobs, and you talk to that person, and that normal process that takes 6 hours, how did you get that done in 10 minutes? Well, I'm using this AI tool. So the faster that information gets spread, the more time, more sharing of those ideas, and the more likely that people will get pulled in to take part. Then we have co-design. If you want buy-in, you have to involve the people who will actually use the tools. Your faculty, your advisors, your frontline staff, and students. Bring them in early turns a skeptic into a collaborator. Nobody wants to spend time on that mundane task. If you can show that there's real value, it's predictable, it's safe, and it works, they're going to be all over it. Leadership also plays a huge role. When leaders use AI appropriately and talk openly about it, they set this tone. It signals that AI is not just this trend, it's a campus-wide priority. And finally, we need clear guardrails. When policies and expectations are transparent, people stop worrying about using AI the wrong way. Clarity reduces anxiety. So the message here is simple. Resistance isn't a barrier, it's a signal. And with training, communication, collaboration, leadership, and clear policies, resistance becomes momentum. So AI governance is the structure that keeps AI use safe, consistent, and aligned with values. So first, we have cross-functional governance body. This means bringing together academic leadership, IT, legal, student representatives, and others so decisions affect diverse perspectives. Next, principles and policies must be translated into actionable guidelines. It's not enough to have high-level statements. Teams need clear rules for how AI can be used in teaching, operations, and decision-making. We also need a use case intake and review process. You want everybody who's going to use AI to kind of bring it in, make sure you don't reproduce the same concepts. You want to make sure what's the impact of this, what's the risk, are you covering privacy, equity, and data quality and operational readiness. Governance also requires life cycle oversight. Once a solution is deployed, it must be monitored, evaluated, and refined. AI is definitely not the kind of technology that you just put it in and you're good. Finally, governance should align with reference frameworks where appropriate. So as the states and the federal government and local government and students come up with different principles and guidance, you need to make sure you reference those in what you're doing so that your institution stays current, compliant, and responsible. So AI governance provides a structure that keeps innovation safe, accountable, and sustainable. So this slide is meant to outline a roadmap for moving from an isolated pilot to a campus-wide adoption. To start, we start with discovery and prioritization. The institution should identify high-impact, low-risk use cases. Then we move on to design and pilot, build a small, well-scoped pilot with clear guardrails, success matrix. It's not perfection we're looking for. It's to learn quickly and safely. We evaluate the impact. What's changed? Did outcomes improve? Did workflow load shift? Were there equity or compliance concerns? We evaluate this step to inform everything that happens next. After that comes scaling thoughtfully. Expand the pilot isn't copy-paste. You need updated training, support resources, and governance. And then finally, we institutionalize AI as an ongoing capability. AI isn't a one-time project, as I said. So this roadmap helps teams move deliberately, reducing risk while building long-term momentum. So finally, let's look at faculty and staff enablement for AI. It's one of the more important areas, I think, of AI strategy. Technology only succeeds when people feel confident using it. So this starts with role-specific training. Different groups, faculty, advisors, IT administrators need guidance that fits their responsibilities and comfort levels. We also need a safe environment to experiment. Having a sandbox to let people try tools without risk will help build confidence and before applying AI in a real workflow. Create communities of practice or AI champions, that center of excellence concept. Helps the organization share tips, reinforce good habits, and sustain momentum. Then there's the value of templates, and guides. Clear syllabus language, assignment frameworks, and communication examples reduce guesswork and make adoption easier. And finally, we must maintain a feedback loop. Faculty and staff should be able to report concerns, highlight the good things, suggest improvements so the AI program continuously evolves. And in short, AI adoption accelerates when people feel supported, trained, and part of the process. So when we talk about moving an AI use case from experimentation into full production, this checklist becomes your reality check. Each item helps ensure you're not just deploying something that works in a demo, you're deploying something that's sustainable, responsible, and operationally sound. So let's start with value. The use case must solve a real problem. It needs a measurable benefit. If you can't articulate the outcome or quantify the improvement, probably isn't ready. And this is probably the biggest one. Gee, this would be cool if we could get this video or this sound or get this summary, but is it actually adding value? That's an important, that ROI kind of discussion. Next is risk. Every deployment carries risk. There's privacy risk, there's security, academic integrity, equity. They all need to be evaluated and mitigated. Higher education environments, and specifically, have unique sensitivities around student data, decision transparency, and compliance. Make sure you've addressed those before you move forward. And of course, the question that underlines all of this, and that is the data. The model is only as good as the data behind it. That means governed sources, correct classifications, and clarity about what the data in the system is allowed to use, which data it's allowed to use. If there's uncertainty here, pause and resolve it. And of course, human oversight. It's non-negotiable. You need accountable owners. You need review mechanisms. Someone is responsible for monitoring the output, intervening when needed, and ensuring decisions stay aligned with your values. And sustainability, as I said already today, it's not a one and done project. And I think people don't really understand that these AI agents need this care and feeding. You need the capacity to support the solution long term. That means technically monitoring it, make sure that the training for the stakeholders is kept up to date, continuously improving it. These models are changing all the time. Normally we install an ERP solution and we're good for 20 years. Now, and maybe every 5 years you do an upgrade. Here, it's literally week to week, month to month. The models are changing, the functionality is changing, and so that constant update is very important. And together, I think these 5 points give you a disciplined way to say, yes, this use case is ready to move from pilot into real world operation. So what are the other ones doing? What are other companies or other institutions doing? So this slide is just kind of highlights some how AI has moved from a pilot to enterprise level adoption. A couple of notable items on here. CSU is deploying AI to 460,000 students, and it shows it treating AI as a core digital infrastructure, not just this optional tool that maybe you want to use. You've got Northeastern's partnership with Anthropic. Anthropic is more in the news now. It's kind of the side one you don't hear a lot about with Claude, but its reasoning and its tool ability for coding, and it's really strong in the area of ethics and accountability. It shows institutions selecting models intentionally based on their academic behavior and reasoning, not just their general overall AI capabilities. ODU and RPI demonstrates 2 architectural paths, either a cloud-first AI hub that can scale, or an on-premise AI compute space for research-intense institutions. Ohio State is shifting AI literacy from an elective skill to a graduation level expectation, which is likely to spread overall sector-wide, I think. And then products like Canvas integrating AI directly into their LMS matters because it brings AI into the daily workflow of students and faculty. So here are the major AI directions shaping higher education over the next 5 years. I think agentic AI is already happening. It's the biggest shift it's going to be. Do we trust these? Is it going to actually go beyond answering questions to take action, automate multi-step tasks, and support AI-first workflows? If we can get to that trust level. Adaptive learning systems, as we said today, that ability to personalize instruction by responding instantly to student behavior and engagement. Collaborative agents are happening already. True teammates, generating ideas, supporting decisions, and learning user preferences. With rising autonomy, then governance must evolve as well. Institutions will need stronger oversight, clearer policies, and ethical guardrails. I think cross-domain generalist agents will break down functional silos so that instead of having to go to the finance agent, you're going to have one that handles multiple things across admissions, finance, student success, and more. And I think these shifts move AI from just being a support tool to an institutional partner shaping every aspect of operations. So let's finish up here and look at our key takeaways for today. So I think if there's one message, it's that AI ready isn't about chasing, do I use OpenAI? Do I use Google? What do I use? It's about getting the right foundation right, not so much the specific tool. That means solid data and architecture, starting with targeted pilots, not trying to do the whole thing at once, putting governance and policy in place, and investing in culture and capacity so people feel supported, not replaced. I think that's key to where we are in society right now across all businesses. It also means partnering and sharing what works and building AI literacy so everyone, a student, faculty, staff, so we all can use these tools thoughtfully. So my hope is that you leave with both a sense of what's possible and a practical way to move forward on your own campus. So I'm happy to stay in touch if you'd like to continue the conversation. And let's open it up. Here's my contact information, and we can open it up for questions now.
Folks, a second here to type any questions into the chat. Ray, thank you always, as always, for sharing your expertise and knowledge here. Having had you, give this update as part of the forum for the last several years, I'm always fascinated to hear about the developments there. And it certainly sounds like even though the Super Bowl ads told us that AI had everything figured out and was completely refined and working as designed here, that there's still a lot of work that has to go into things for us to be able to figure out how institutions are going to be able to adapt and incorporate it, and what that looks like from the back end perspective there. So as always, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise on this. We'll go ahead and jump into our second session for today. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Nick Bava.
Hi everyone, great to be here with you today. We'll go through just a quick introduction here real quick. I know Anthony's had a chance to introduce himself. For those that don't know me, my name is Nick Bava. I am a principal at Sikich, specialize in the local government audit space. So I work closely alongside Anthony year-round, and with folks like you in the higher education space. Work with various colleges here, specifically in Illinois. But excited to be here with you today to go through the ever favorite GASB update, and we'll dig into things here shortly. So from an agenda perspective, we wanted to take some time to recap the newest GASB pronouncements while also hitting on some of the projects that GASB is currently working on in process. So we have a look at what's coming down the pike here and what we need to know. So the plan for today, I'll take everyone through GASB statements 102 and 103, and then I'll pass things over to Anthony, who will cover statements 104 and 105, while also providing some insight into the process of GASB's technical agenda and really what you can expect to see here in the future. All right, so let's dig in here. First one we have today is GASB statement 102 on certain risk disclosures. So just some background on this. various types of stakeholders had expressed concerns about risks that governments face that may limit their ability to acquire resources or maybe control spending. Concerns that I'd say were certainly amplified as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you look at GASB's counterpart on the FASB side, there is general disclosure guidance that requires a non-governmental entity to disclose risks and uncertainties that may factor into its operations, as well as its current vulnerabilities, tied to certain concentrations. So local governments and institutions like those with us today certainly face a variety of risks that could negatively impact the level of service that you provide or your ability to meet obligations as they come due. And although governments have been required to disclose information about their exposure to some of those risks, ultimately the essential information about other risks that are more prevalent among local governments and folks like you today, it hasn't been routinely disclosed because it hasn't been explicitly required. So that's where GASB Statement 102 comes in on certain risk disclosures. When did this come into effect? The effective date was for fiscal years beginning after June 15th, 2024, and all reporting periods thereafter. So common fiscal year ends, if you were a June 30th, 2025 fiscal year end, you've already gone through this analysis. December 31st, 2025 year ends, currently in that process right now, and April 30th, 2026. So what does GASB 102 accomplish? It accomplishes improvements to financial reporting, and just looking at these two bullet points here, disclosures, ultimately will provide users with timely information regarding certain concentrations or constraints. That's the focus of this standard, concentrations or constraints, and I'll get into those definitions here in a bit. It ultimately results in users of your financial statements having better information with which to understand and anticipate certain risks that a government might be facing, okay? So the good news is that this is only a footnote requirement standard, so nothing impacting the balance sheet, the income statement. Additionally, GASB, I'd say, has made it a relatively high bar to clear in terms of ultimately needing these additional disclosures in your audit report. And while it's something that you'll certainly need to evaluate on an annual basis with your auditors, with management, applicability, will likely not be as common when it comes to having to implement Statement 102. So with that being said, when is a disclosure required? There's a few requirements that you need to meet here, and that's outlined at these bullet points. So the first being, a disclosure is required when a concentration or constraint is known to the government prior to the financial statement issuance, and they are vulnerable to the risk of substantial impact. And additionally, an event has occurred, begun to occur, or is more likely than not to begin to occur within 12 months of the date that the financial statements are issued. Last item here, if mitigating action is taken prior to the issuance, and that causes any of these criteria to not be met, then you're exempt from meeting a disclosure. So those are the disclosure requirements. Now, kind of digging into it a little bit more, for the purposes of determining the likelihood of the occurrence of an event associated with a concentration or constraint, GASB concluded that a criteria of more likely than not ultimately produced a favorable balance between screening out events that may never materialize and providing information that is essential to the financial statement user. So in particular, they believe that the more likely than not threshold is the most suitable expression of the probability for the occurrence of an event that will ultimately derive a disclosure. Again, with the ultimate goal of focusing on those circumstances that make your government, your institution vulnerable to, a heightened possibility of loss or harm. Now, additionally, GASB decided that the focus should be on the general concept of the vulnerability to the risk of a substantial impact, and they concluded that the term impact broadly conveys, what they described as a financially disruptive event to the normal functioning of your government. Okay, so an example that I've used before is, a state, your state may establish a constraint related to the level of outstanding general obligation that your institution may incur. So that's certainly a constraint that your institution's subject to, but say if your institution has little or no general obligation debt outstanding and it's not approaching that limit, then that constraint hasn't made your institution vulnerable to the risk of substantial impact, and then therefore needing to require, needing a disclosure to elaborate on that. So if you did meet the disclosure requirement, what does that disclosure look like? So it's a few things, nothing more than a short paragraph, but the disclosure should include the concentration or constraint, each event associated with the concentration or constraint that could cause a substantial impact if the event had occurred or had begun to occur prior to the issuance of your financial statements, and then any actions taken by your organization prior to the issuance of those financial statements to mitigate that risk. And again, I mentioned this on the previous slide, but an important note here, if you had a concentration or constraint that was moving towards a disclosure, if mitigating actions taken by your organization prior to the issuance of that audit report happen to cause any of the disclosure criteria to not be met, then none of the disclosures would need to be required in your audit report. So you heard me mention the terms concentrations or constraints. Those are the focuses in terms of the certain risks that you should be looking at and going through within your institution. Now, from a definition perspective, a concentration is a lack of diversity related to an aspect of a significant inflow of resources, such as a revenue, or an outflow of resources, such as an expense. Now, we have some examples here for you of concentrations and constraints. These are pulled directly from the standard, not trying to be all encompassing here. So just to generate more thought, for those with us today in terms of what might be a concentration or constraint within your jurisdiction. So you certainly could have concentrations related to employers. A concentration might exist when a small number of employers comprise a significant portion of the total employment within, the jurisdiction of your government. One employer moving to another jurisdiction or going out of business could certainly result in a substantial decrease in your government's tax base. On the industry side of things, some governments may rely on a principal industry that would happen to maybe dominate their tax base. Could be tourism industry, retail industry, something like that. And tax revenues could be lost or otherwise substantially affected if there happened to be a disruption in one of those industries. Workforce covered by a collective bargaining agreement. A government may be unable to adequately control spending if a sizable portion of your government's employees are covered by a CBA that maybe locks in wages, benefits, staffing levels, things like that. Provider financial resources. Maybe a sizable portion of your organization's significant revenue streams come from a small number of large providers, and you're concentrated on that end. And then lastly here, suppliers of material, labor, or services. A government that is reliant on a particular supplier for critical materials and services that may result in something along the lines of a spending-related concentration. So those are concentrations. On the constraint side of things, the definition of a constraint is a limitation that is imposed by an external party or by formal action of your government's highest level of decision-making authority. So your governing board of your organization. Again, have some examples here for you, not intended to be all encompassing here, but just to generate some good thought amongst those with us here. So the first one we have is a potential constraint on limitations related to raising revenue. Constraints on a government's ability to obtain resources could include those imposed by maybe creditors, grantors, contributors, maybe enabling legislation. You could have statutory limitations such as state-imposed caps on the assessment or levying of property taxes, for example. So that's on the raising revenue side of things. Limitations on spending. A government's ability to control spending may be adversely affected by limitations on what costs can be incurred and in what amounts. An example of that might be debt covenants. Those typically stipulate the level of spending relative to a pledged revenue. Limitations on the incurrence of debt. We mentioned this earlier, right? There may be statutory or constitutional limitations on such as constraints on the total amount of debt that your organization may have outstanding. Mandated spending. Mandates to expend resources on a particular program that may diminish, your organization's spending flexibility. So overall, GASB concluded that the identification of a concentration or a constraint is a matter of professional judgment and is based on both qualitative and quantitative factors. They concluded that it would not be overly burdensome or costly for your organizations to obtain knowledge of its concentrations or constraints for the purposes of ultimately assessing the disclosure criteria. And they believe that because they felt that those conditions are known by your government as a fundamental aspect of understanding your government's financial risk profile. So, to close out our thoughts on Statement 102, I'd say when you work through this exercise at your institution, think broadly, cast a wide net in terms of identifying concentrations or constraints that may exist within your organization, whether it's large or small. Some may not carry significant weight at the moment, but they could become more impactful over time or under different circumstances. And being proactive, upfront, and thorough in your assessment, I'd say will certainly help ensure that you're well positioned to address, potential risks before they escalate.
Before we move into 103, I just wanted to, chime in here with a comment. If you don't mind going back just to the concentration slide, just wanted to highlight, for folks here, obviously in, higher ed, we oftentimes have a pretty diverse revenue stream. You may have property taxes, you have tuition and fees, obviously grants are a large portion of that. And as we look at providers of financial resources as a potential concentration here, certainly I feel that we're in a time where there certainly is a vulnerability that everyone should be considering if you get, federal grant funds there, as we hear conversation regularly coming out of Washington related to the potential elimination of the DOE and what that impact would be there. Now, again, in and of itself, that vulnerability may be something that is there from a concentration standpoint, and then the impact as to how that affects your organization would be organization specific as part of that. But those are the types of things, as you look at those considerations and make those considerations to factor into it there. Now, if that means that you would have those mitigating procedures and mitigating steps that Nick mentioned that you put into place for that, it does give you the chance to not necessarily have a required disclosure there, because again, this is a high bar in terms of what GASB set for needing to actually have a disclosure here. But again, you may think that with your revenue streams, you may be pretty well positioned and pretty well set there. But again, think creatively in terms of what this could look like for your organization. Again, cast that wide net as to what may be out there, and consider those things as you're looking at your implementation of 102 and your ongoing, these are standards, right? You go through the implementation initially for that there, but then you have to continue to look at these things and take into account the impact of these statements on a go forward basis as well. So thanks, Nick, for letting me just share a couple additional thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. All right. GASB Statement 103, Financial Reporting Model Improvement. So this is one that we've been talking about and looking at for years now, and I'd say for quite some time. This was GASB's largest scale project on its technical agenda, in which initially they were looking at a complete overhaul of the GASB 34 financial reporting model. Good news is that after gathering quite a bit of feedback and input from leaders of local government, constituents, things like that, GASB drastically reduced the scope of Statement 103, and the impact is markedly less significant than what had been proposed over the years in terms of what the standards set out to be. So this is an example of I'd say GASB's process working in terms of the diligence that they did and the feedback that they gathered in order to ultimately reach the conclusions that they did. And I think we can all say here that we certainly appreciate the fact that they scaled things back, considering the level of effort that's been required over the last 5 years with recent standards, whether it's leases, software subscriptions, or compensated absences, right? So what did we end up with when we look at Statement 103? First of all, from an applicability standpoint, this is applicable for fiscal year ends beginning after June 15th, 2025. So specifically, we have 3 here for you: June 30th, 2026 year ends, December 31st, 2026 year ends, and then April 30th, 2027. So let's get into the next slide. Overall, GASB is just looking to really improve some key components here, and we'll look at kind of the main 6 here that were impacted as part of this issuance. So I have called this at certain times the wait there's more standard. And while there's a handful of items to consider here listed with Statement 103, I'd say the overall impact isn't too cumbersome when it will come time to implement. So as far as impacted sections go, first we have listed here is the management's discussion and analysis, which we'll dive into here shortly. Second bullet point we have here is really just some terminology changes with unusual and infrequent items. These were previously called extraordinary and special items. Third, we have some changes to proprietary fund financial statements, which will certainly impact those with us today and how institutions present their statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position. Fourth, there were some changes to major component unit presentation requirements. Fifth, modifications related to the presentation of budgetary comparison information. And then finally, some changes related to the statistical section, specifically within the financial trends section of that section. So the changes, when we looked at the changes related to major component unit presentation and budgetary comparisons, we don't see that being overly, applicable or impactful to institutions like colleges or universities. So in the interest of time today, our focus will be on the other four components. So when we dig into that here, the first being the management's discussion and analysis. So what's changing with the MD&A? The biggest piece of the MD&A, and I think the best way that I can really sum this up, is that this document has been often viewed by financial statement users as too generic. I think it often tells you how much line items change, but it's missed the why. It's missed the actual analysis piece. So GASB took a look at this and ultimately worked to try to simplify this section with the goal of making the MD&A, better, more thoughtful and more useful. So what we have here is our current sections for the MD&A. This is through GASB Statement 34 and what's required currently under current guidance. So 8 components. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. I won't list them out here for you, but this is the information that is currently makes up your MD&A, or is what's supposed to make up your MD&A. So GASB took a look at this and they said, let's scale this back and let's pare it down a bit. And here on the next slide is what this new section for the MD&A looks like under Statement 103. So we've gone from 8 sections to 5 sections. First, we have the overview section, which is pretty consistent with the prior requirements. Second, the financial summary section, again, also consistent with what's historically been disclosed and included. The third section here is the new piece. This is the detailed analysis section, and this is the part that I alluded to that's really been missing, both from GASB's perspective as well as GFOA's perspective, in their review of your financial statements. Those that submit to the GFOA and the certificate program, you certainly might have seen some comments and suggestions surrounding your analysis within the MD&A, and I'd say they've made an effort over the last few years really trying to reinforce the upcoming requirements that Statement 103 calls out here on that. Moving on to the fourth section, covers significant capital asset and long-term financing activity. Again, that's a requirement of the old section, so no changes there. And then the fifth and final section, covering any currently known facts, decisions, or conditions. So again, overall not too bad in terms of changes. Fewer sections, with ultimately the main change being centered around that detailed analysis section. So you may have to go through the exercise of moving your analysis throughout the entire letter to the certain section called detailed analysis, but overall I'd say the structure and the content that you've had historically won't have to change. It'll just require that thoughtful detailed analysis section, that third part here. So the next bullet point on the list of changes is unusual or infrequent items, and really this is just some new terminology here again. Replacing what was called extraordinary and special items. The definition doesn't change, so the transaction that might fall under this umbrella must be unusual in nature and infrequent in occurrence. Now, unusual in nature means an event or transaction is abnormal or significantly different from the ordinary and typical transactions that your institution sees. Infrequent in occurrence is an event or transaction that isn't reasonably expected to occur, say, in the foreseeable future. So I'd say that typically this is a pretty high bar to clear when you would need to present these items. But again, this is in the scope of the standard and something to consider if your organization comes across a transaction that might qualify. You can see here the last item listed as an example. This example is provided directly from GASB in terms of a disaster recovery grant that may trigger the need for that itemization of these items. So say if your organization experienced a natural disaster outside of your control, and as a result of that disaster, your institution incurred expenses to remediate and clean up damage in the amount of $10 million. And also as a result, you receive support in the form of grants from the state to the tune of $2.5 million to assist with that cleanup effort. So due to the material impact of that situation and the unusual and infrequent nature of those transactions, that something like this would likely trigger the required reporting where you would separately list that revenue and expense as unusual or infrequent items right before your change in net position. So the next piece here, this slide focuses on updates to proprietary fund financial statements, specifically the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position, which certainly impacts folks with us today that report their financial statements using that business type activities model. So there are really three key changes to be aware of and consider. The first being a format update. The layout of this new statement has been revised to ultimately improve clarity and consistency across those that report these statements, and ultimately affects how information is organized and presented within those statements. The next change was a redefinition of operating versus non-operating, and the distinction between operating and non-operating revenues and expenses and things like that. Finally, the third key change was the introduction of a new category called subsidies. So these are amounts that are received to support ongoing operations such as interfund transfers or external support that doesn't meet the definition of exchange revenue. And these subsidies are now broken out separately to increase transparency and highlight, the financial support that isn't directly tied to the core operating activities of your institution. So this slide ultimately breaks down how your proprietary fund financial statements now categorize non-operating and operating revenues and expenses under this new guidance. So starting at the top here, non-operating revenues and expenses, these are items that are not directly related to the core operations of the fund or your institution. So they include those subsidies received or provided. So financial support from other funds or governments, those are now separately classified. If you have contributions to endowments, those would be donations made to or from permanent or term endowments. Also, non-operating items include, financing related items. Think of interest revenue or expense, any other items tied to debt or borrowings. Then you'd have your disposal of capital assets or inventory. These would be your typical gains or losses from selling off long-term assets or inventory. Then you have your investment income and expenses, right? These are your earnings or losses from investments such as interest, dividends, changes in fair value, things like that. Finally, your operating revenues and expenses, these are simply tied to your day-to-day services that you provide, like user fees, salaries, things like that. It supports the core mission of your fund and your institution, and it's considered operating. So I mentioned, this on a couple slides ago, this new item on the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position called subsidies. So just kind of really reinforcing the definition of what these include. So it's a few things. It's resources received from another party or fund for which the proprietary fund does not provide goods and services, and that directly or indirectly keep the fund's current or future fees and charges lower than they would be otherwise. So that's if you're receiving funds. You could also be providing to a party or fund. So that be for which the recipient does not provide goods or services to the fund, and that they are recoverable through the fund's current or future pricing policies. And then lastly, all other transfers that may occur. So think of financial support, your organizations receive to help run operations that are not tied directly to capital projects, things like property taxes or grants to help cover operating costs. Those would be defined as subsidies. Now, ultimately, you'll want to work with your auditors to ensure that these non-capital subsidies are properly separated out from non-operating activities on your statements. And overall, it's not an extremely heavy lift, more so just working to ensure that the presentation of your financial statements is in compliance with what these new reporting requirements are asking. All right, so the last section we'll cover here on Statement 103. I told you I wasn't joking when I called this the Wait There's More standard. So this is the statistical section and specifically changes within the financial trends information. Now, this is only applicable for those, with us today that, prepare and include a statistical section in your audit report. Maybe you have an annual comprehensive financial report. If you don't include a statistical section, then this section, you can ignore this essentially. But the financial trend section, was put into place to help users see how the government's financial position has changed over time, usually across, over a 10-year period, right? Now, the specific rule we're focusing on is when a government has only business type operations, or if you have a mix of business type or fiduciary activities, the financial trend section must present revenues by major source, and we have to break those revenues down in a meaningful way and in line with these new reporting changes. So what that means is we're now showing them into 3 categories here. We have the operating income or loss, your non-capital subsidies, and then your other non-operating revenues and expenses. So it's just ultimately ensuring that your statistical section is going to be updated to reflect that new presentation of the proprietary fund income statement.
Thank you, Nick. And as you go through the process of implementing 103, I encourage you to, talk with others as you go through that implementation. I think what would be the scenario that GASB and for those of you that participate in the GFOA program would not want to see is the ending up in a similar situation of having a very boilerplate set of MD&As that are out there for that. And we think about that from an MD&A standpoint, right? This is oftentimes in a very large set of audited financial statements that you're issuing. That may be the only thing that someone looks at in the financial statements, or the only thing that they're able to really make sense of in many cases for that. So being able to effectively look at that MD&A and walk away with a good understanding of what happened at your organization during the course of the year and providing that underlying why. So thank you, Nick, for sharing 102 and 103 updates there. So let's talk next about GASB 104. And GASB 104 covers disclosure of certain capital assets. From a time frame standpoint, again, this one also effective for June 30th, 2026 year ends and thereafter. And 104 is one of those unique circumstances where GASB has provided guidance and issued pronouncements previously, particularly as it relates to 104 in statements 87, 94, and 96. And 104 gets more granular and more specific as to how those amounts are required to be presented within the financial statements there. So as we look at the next slide here, we'll see the impact of this statement, and we'll be able to look at the capital asset footnote. And ultimately, what we have to do as part of statement 104 is separate out the disclosures and then separate out the lines for the items that were presented and given to us as requirements under those standards that I just mentioned, 87, 94, and 96. So statement 87 on leases, we all know leases and the lease standard very well at this point, I'm sure. Required to present any leased items where you are the lessee by major class of asset in your note disclosure there. Statement 94, as a reminder, this is public-private or public-public partnerships there. So right to use assets that you're recognizing as the operator there. Again, those also need to be reported by major class of asset. And then finally, if you have any statement 96 subscription-based information technology assets or SPIDA assets there, reporting those as well. If you do have any other intangible assets that don't fall under one of the standards noted specifically in 104, so 87, 94, or 96, then you are going to report those by major class of asset as well. One key note here as well, the disclosure as you look at this and as you present in your financial statements and the notes is required to be there for both the cost side of things as well as any associated or related amortization for that there. So simply put, to incorporate and adopt this standard, making sure that your presentation is aligned with statement 104 and that you do have the ability to see those amounts separately in the note disclosure here. So our next slide will show us what this actually looks like in practice. Our example here's a capital asset disclosure as part of this statement here. Again, putting those directly there, you'll see the subscription assets, for example, reported here, as well as not only in the cost section, but in the related amortization section as well. So again, if you don't have anything if you don't have all three of these, you don't obviously need to include amounts or items that are not applicable to your organization there. But again, if you do have anything that falls under one of the noted standards here, making sure that you're presenting that in accordance with the requirements of statement 104 in your note disclosure. Our next slide here, we'll talk about capital assets held for resale. So one of the things, not necessarily a very common thing that we see in the higher ed space, but if you did have a capital asset that's being held for resale, Statement 104 does require that we would go through a reassessment as part of each reporting period for that. From a disclosure standpoint, you will continue to report those amounts by major class of assets on the roll forward, but you do need to have a separate disclosure of those amounts regarding historical costs and any accumulated depreciation to the notes on there as well. If you do have any debt associated with those assets, where the assets and the amounts held for sale are pledged for that there, separate disclosure is required in those circumstances as well. And then finally, you do need to break that out if you did present. Most cases on the higher ed standpoint, from a GASB standpoint, you're presenting just under the BTA model or business type activities model there, but it is a requirement to have those separated in the standard as well. So GASB 104, really, again, this was the looking at, from a GASB standpoint, cleaning up some of the inconsistencies in practice that they saw from the implementations of the statements 87, 94, and 96 for that there. Again, making sure that the note disclosures are properly reflective of what statement 104 requires, separating out those amounts by those different types of standards. Most recent standard issues are next one here, GASB 105 on subsequent events. Statement 105 is effective for fiscal years beginning after June 15th of 2026 or June 30th, 2027 and thereafter. As we look at statement 105, this was looking to provide some additional consistency and improve the reporting on subsequent events. We did also get, as part of the GASB 105, GASB did take a look at what was in statement 56 as it related to subsequent events there. And ultimately, the intent here being twofold. One, addressing confusion as to when something needed to be reported and how to apply those standards. Two, inconsistency in practice with that. And I think, the third piece here that is listed here, right, is always just provide more useful information. I think GASB constantly looks at things through that lens in terms of what they're trying to do on this and how we navigate that. So as we look here at the definition of a subsequent event, our next slide shows us the definition here. And again, generally not going to kind of read a slide verbatim here, but I think definition wise, this is crucial to understand. Subsequent events are transactions or other events that occur after the date of the financial statements, but before the date of the financial statement issuance or before the financial statements are available to be issued. The date at which the financial statements are available to be issued is the date at which the financial statements are in a complete form and format that complies with GAAP, and all approvals necessary for issuance have been obtained. So we have to understand, again, that definition of what is a subsequent event, when something qualifies as a subsequent event. And then from there, we'll go into what we actually break out for the two different types of subsequent events that we have. So the first type of subsequent event that we have is something we call a recognized event here. A recognized event is something that is indicative of conditions that existed as of the balance sheet date, and it informs the inputs to an accounting estimate measured as of that date here. So if you think about if you have a claims liability here, and you have amounts that were going into that estimate as part of that process there, oftentimes that may be a recognized event there, being able to do that there. In this case, for a recognized event, the effects of those amounts should be incorporated into the measurement of the accounting estimates reported as of the financial statement date. So what that means, you're going to actually look at if it's material, reporting an entry, and adjusting for those recognized events within the financial statements to ensure that those are actually reported there as well. Claims, litigation, settlement, things of that nature, often things that we see from a recognized event standpoint there. The alternative to a recognized event, obviously, would be a non-recognized event. A non-recognized event is something that has a significant effect that could be a favorable or unfavorable effect on the financial statements there. One of the following things reported here, this is it could be a debt-related transaction. So if you issue debt after the financial statements, if you have a government combination or disposal government operation, so a GASB 69 transaction there, a change to the legally separate entities that compose the financial reporting entity. If you have the application of an enacted tax rate that is different from the tax rate previously in effect, and then finally a transaction or other event that is of such nature that the information items are essential to a user's understanding and use of the financial statements there. So as we look at that, key thing with non-recognized events, these are notes to financial statement impact only here. And again, looking at the fourth bullet point there, the application of an enacted tax rate that is different, encourage you to look at the actual standard here and the impact of that there. On its face, that could make you think that there's going to be non-recognized event and disclosures every single year. Anytime you have any sort of different tax rates or changes to your tax rates there, GASB got a ton of feedback when it came to that particular component of the standard there. Do take a look at the actual pronouncement itself, the basis for conclusions. Make sure that you have a good understanding and conversations with your auditors as to what that impact of 105 and when you do or don't have a recognized or non-recognized event to report there. From there, we'll move on to GASB's technical agenda. Now, GASB has a great, easy to look at chart available on their website. I encourage you, if you haven't checked this out, to go out and just look at it. It's a good way to have a handle in terms of what is out there from a project standpoint there, and also for the standards that are further along in the process there. It will tell you kind of what the next milestone is related to that standard, as well as GASB's expected timing for that standard there as well. So again, a wealth of information that's out there for it there. For those of you that attend the annual GFOA conference, one of the things that's been harped upon over the last several years is that the volume and the amount of things that are actually on GASB's technical agenda is significantly less than it has been in recent years. And I know many of you are probably thinking, well, it's about time, because certainly with the standards that we've implemented over the last several years, whether it be related to going back to the pension standards, OPEB standards, certainly leases, SPIDAs, compensated absences over the last several years, there's been no shortage of standards, and no shortage of standards that have been come along with a really heavy lift as part of that process as well. So refreshing to some degree to see that the technical agenda is not as voluminous as it has been in years past. Now with that, the first item and the biggest item on the technical agenda is the revenue and expense recognition model. And I come bearing initial good news in terms of this is that we've got some time to see what this is going to look like still. There are still ongoing meetings, discussions, deliberations happening at the GASB related to the revenue and expense recognition project. And reason being is this is a massive undertaking in terms of what GASB is looking at here, and a massive set of changes that comes with this as well. Nick alluded to the fact that, GASB 103, as it was initially presented and initially put out there, was going to have a much larger, much more significant potential impact on financial reporting for units of local government, both higher education and non-higher education as part of that. That obviously got scaled back significantly, and Nick shared kind of the key components as to what made it into the actual standard there. And again, revenue and expense recognition, I think, is going to be a similar project, in the sense that when we do get an exposure draft on the revenue and expense recognition project, I expect that GASB will do a lot of listening to stakeholders as part of that process. I envision it will be a lengthy due process that, calendar and timeline that GASB will operate under as it relates to the revenue and expense recognition project. And I think that's appropriate, and I think it's necessary. Simply put, the impact of the standard should not be underestimated for that. Why do we have a revenue and expense recognition? What's GASB looking at here? So there's a couple of different components here. First is, when we look at the current guidance on revenue and expense recognition, we think about exchange and non-exchange transactions. So we have non-exchange transaction guidance, and then really that's primarily lives in GASB statement 33 as a centralized kind of location for non-exchange transaction. But that's outdated at this point. We're 25 plus years from GASB 33's issuance there. The other thing that GASB has identified in its conversations and dialogue and looking at the revenue and expense recognition is that the guidance for exchange transactions is really lacking or limited in many cases there. Now, what we had initially with the revenue and expense recognition project is we were expecting an exposure draft in the fourth quarter of 2025. As you'll see here, as you can see, that exposure draft has been pushed back to Q1 of 2027. So we're still several years away from a standard, as well as any actual effective date for this as well, based on the amount of work that we expect this is going to take. Now, what are the objectives here as we look at kind of what GASB is trying to do with the revenue and expense recognition project? As I mentioned, the guidance on exchange transactions was lacking. So GASB is looking to provide guidance primarily on expenses as well as exchange revenue transactions. Looking at GASB 33, those non-exchange transactions, making updates, seeing if that's still functioning and operating in the manner it was intended to for that there. As part of this, GASB is also looking at the conceptual framework and making considerations associated with that. And finally, the biggest piece, and this is, we regularly see GASB look at and follow what's happening on the International and the Financial Accounting Standards Board. So we'll talk about performance obligations as well, and that's part of the considerations as well in terms of what that looks like. When we look at revenue and expense recognition, we're going to come down to this idea of categorization. Categorization starts off category A, as it's been discussed to date by the GASB, is when you have satisfaction of a performance obligation for that. Category B encompasses the other components there. Category B provides us with information on derived revenues, imposed revenues. You may have situations where you have a contractual binding arrangement, shared revenues, and then general aid to governments here is another component as to what you would have in that category B. So as we break down category A and category B a little bit more, here are some of the items that you might see in the respective categories there. Category A, fees for specific services there, looking at that last one, right? Tuition, obviously a very common one there. Expenditure-driven grants, research grants, and revolving loans. These are going to fall in that category A classification. Category B, again, taxes, purpose-restricted grants or donations that you might have, other types of donations, other regulatory fees if you have any items along those lines. But again, you can kind of see the breakdown as to what this looks like from a category A and category B, at least again at the early stages of what GASB has put out there in terms of its considerations on the revenue and expense project here. I mentioned that there's not a ton of things on the current project list here. So I'll briefly just highlight these for you as well. GASB is looking at the going concern. And going concern is certainly, I think, a topic that and a term that has more relevance in in the corporate non-government sector for that. So GASB is looking at that, whether that term is really appropriate. They're outline that and kind of talking through what they call severe financial stress and defining what that looks like there. So we do expect a exposure draft on that statement, but next second quarter 27 in terms of that. The 2026 implementation guide, always a interesting update provided by the GASB there in terms of what's out there on the guidance that has previously been issued and providing some updates in terms of that. Infrastructure assets exposure draft expected Q1 of 2026. And then finally, we are expecting a due process document from GASB on its voluntary digital financial reporting model in the second quarter of this year. Now, voluntary digital financial reporting, the keyword there being voluntary in terms of this, but this aligns very closely, kind of with what we see from the SEC, from the FDTA, or the Financial Data Transparency Act, considerations that are going into the, as we look at digital taxonomies, things of that nature there. Some of you may be subject to, certain requirements from a reporting standpoint there that falls under, taxonomy or digital financial reporting requirements there. So something to be aware of there. But again, GASB is doing that as a voluntary process there as well. With that, that wraps up our GASB update for today. So you do have contact information for both Nick and myself here, as well as our LinkedIn pages there. Should you have any questions, any follow-ups that you'd like to make, or if you just like to connect and reach out and have a conversation with us, we're always happy to connect as part of that. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the forum. So thank you again for joining us today, and hopefully if you were able to join us yesterday as well. Thank you to Nick and Ray for their presentations today. Thank you behind the scenes to Rachel and Carrie and our marketing team for all of their hard work in terms of putting on our forum on a year in and year out basis for that. After the webinar completes here, you will have an opportunity to fill out a post-event survey. Please do that. We do take your feedback and input seriously as part of the process as we look at scheduling and planning our future forums and future trainings that we do as part of the process there. If you answered the questions in the polling questions today and are looking for CPE credit, again, just give our team, you should say within 2 weeks or so at the latest, you should have those CPE certificates as part of that as well. Again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us. We hope this was beneficial, educational for you. Wishing you all the best, and we'll hope to see you at next year's forum. Thanks, everyone.